Hola, bienvenidos a Voces de África, donde las historias de éxito y el espíritu del continente africano pretenden cobrar vida. Mi nombre es Navin Kemlani, director de IBS Spain, una empresa consultora estratégica internacional focalizada hacia África desde España y Canarias. Hoy conversamos con Arthur Minsat, jefe de la Unidad de África, Europa y Oriente Medio, Medio Mundo, del Centro de Desarrollo de la OCDE, que es la Organización para la Cooperación y Desarrollo Económico. Arthur Minsat es doctor por la London School of Economics and Science, and Political Science, perdón. Como economista ha dirigido informes como Perspectivas Económicas de África, el African Economic Outlook del Banco Africano de Desarrollo. En el PNUD de las Naciones Unidas en Nueva York, Arthur contribuyó a los informes de desarrollo humano que son tan emblemáticos de Naciones Unidas. En Abiyán fue voluntario en las operaciones de Naciones Unidas en Costa de Marfil durante la crisis electoral del país y también ha trabajado en el sector privado de la mano de Walter Kluber. O sea, tenemos ante nosotros a una persona con muchísima experiencia pese a su juventud. Esta entrevista pretende conocer el rol de la OCDE, de esos 34 países que conforman la OCDE, con los países africanos, desgranar el informe que Arthur y su equipo elaboran cada año desde la OCDE, que se denomina Dinámicas de Desarrollo de África, que se publicó hace escasos meses, y cómo concretamente las empresas españolas pueden contribuir a un desarrollo sostenible e inclusivo en el continente africano que tenemos cerquita, ¿no? Arthur, I'll switch to English, sorry for the introduction in Spanish. It's a true honor to have you with us. Thanks for being with today with us and spend a few minutes to chat about Africa, the report, Spain, etc. So thanks and welcome.
Mucho gusto. Muchas gracias.
Good. Arthur, let's start talking about you first. Could you share with us what was the path to become a senior economist and head of the Africa, Europe, and Middle East? That's half world, almost half world, at the OECD Development Center, and above all, why you focus your career in a social and economic way in Africa?
Thank you, Nevin. First, despite the big name of the unit, we mainly focus on Africa. So, Africa is very big. The continent, it fits together Europe and part of North America in the African continent. So there's a lot to do, and we mainly focus on the African continent. Despite the long title of the unit, including also Europe, but it's mainly the African continent. Very large, very big, more than 54 countries. So it's a lot to do. So my path was first, I think, working in the continent. I had, as a child, my father was working in Chad in Central Africa, so I had the opportunity to go there. Then I also worked as a volunteer, as you mentioned, in Ivory Coast. So having field experience in Africa was very important for me and was a revelation as I could make a lot of friends, but also see that Africa is really the land, the continent of the 21st century, where we have a lot of innovation, a lot of growth, but also a lot of challenges to tackle and to transform them into opportunities. So that's the first thing, is the experience and the very strong interest in the dynamics of development in Africa. Second, so in terms of analytics, so I've done a lot of I love doing research and data crunching and writing, articles and others. Being a nerd, so that was another field why working in the OECD with all these big books every year. Every book in the OECD has maybe 200 pages long, 250 pages long. We have to do that on an annual basis. and sometimes we do more than one book every year. So I really like doing that because I like going in depth into questions that are important for people, and being able to find answers that are empirical. So with that are fact-based, with data, using data that is as reliable as possible. As we know, it can be a challenge when looking at developing countries, also OECD countries, but developing countries more, of course. But I really, it's a passion for me to find evidence-based answers to these questions. And then the third reason why I think it was, my profile was interesting for the OECD is because I had previous experience with other international organizations like the UN, as you mentioned, including the Human Development Report. So I had this experience working on big books, big reports, which is different from an academic publication. So as mentioned, there is the data crunching and analytics that comes together. That is really important, has to be very strong, evidence-based, technically bulletproof evidence that we bring. But at the same time, the audiences, while they include academics and students, it's a broader audience. It includes, private sector firms, financial analysts, but the primary audience are policymakers, because the purpose of the OECD is, the motto is better policies for better lives. So in other words, how to shape policies to improve the well-being of people. So economic growth is one aspect, but we're speaking about well-being. So it's also about social aspects and education and health that are very important. And this is particularly important when we look at Africa because of the informality and the issues coming with social protection issues and others. So the social aspects are really important. And I said, of course, better policies for better lives, but we can also add better data for better policies for better lives, in the sense that everything that we do is data focused, and then we bring the policymakers together, learning from evidences from OECD, from African countries. At the OECD Development Center, we have 11 countries from Africa who are members of the OECD Development Center, but also Latin America and Asia and developing Asia, including China, Indonesia, Thailand, where countries can exchange on their experiences. So if you take, for example, Rwanda is an example of an African country that is one of the members of the Development Center, and they have very interesting policies to, on the recycling, on the plastic use, and others. So that's the OECD Development Center is an opportunity to exchange between countries from Africa, from
good practices,
but also the OECD as well, and have an equal basis and equal partnerships. It's a platform for dialogue as equal partners. All countries have the same voting rights, and that also matches with my vision for development, to have inclusion and empowerment and equal partnerships.
Good, amazing. What are the main lines of work with the continent in the OECD right now, the unit that you lead? What are the main lines? You have shared already that data is key. You provide data, dialogue, but what are the main programs that you are leading in your unit with the continent?
The OECD as a whole, so it's an international organization made of member states. So therefore, the OECD usually focuses either on programs at the country level to serve the member states and, design strategies, policies for the countries who are members, or, or other countries as well. Or it also does regional projects or programs covering a region or a continent and others. In my case, because we have regional units, we really cover the African continent, and the country level work is done by other units who have more of a thematic focus. So thematic, for example, doing country diagnostics on growth, diagnostics on how to integrate value chains, on productive transformation, on the extraction of mining, on urbanization in cities, on gender and others. So this is the type of gender work, social protection as well, of country level work that we would do. But my unit, because of the regional focus and regional integration, is particularly important in the African continent, much more than in other continents. So the aim is to look and work mainly with the African Union. We also work with other organizations. We've worked, for decades with the African Development Bank, for instance. So this is also some of the other partners that we've been working with since, the last 60 years or so. But the aim, the aim is to support the Pan-African organizations to realize the Agenda 2063, so the vision of the African Union member states for development. And since our expertise is in economics, we focus on productive transformation. So how to industrialize African countries in order to create jobs that can, with a higher value added, so more productive jobs, and which is particularly important for the question of well-being of African people that we asked before. Because an economic transformation development needs to create opportunities for growing the skills base, but also quality jobs mean social protection and others, inclusive, and they need to be adapted to the African continent, where the highest share of workers is informal workers. So the aim is to see with the African Union, because they have the more of the country level and the regional expertise, also with the strong ownership from the African Union member states, whereas the OECD Development Center is based in Paris. So we are good at the data crunching, but we have less evidence on what is happening on the ground. So we need these partnerships also to have full ownership by the African governments, and this partnership with the African Pan-African organizations like the African Union, representing all member states. So all projects that we do are with the African Union. It's mainly four main projects. One is the flagship report of the African Union, Africa's Development Dynamics. It's an annual economic report looking at what are the opportunities for Africa's development, sustainable, productive transformation. So we've looked in the past at growth, jobs, and inequalities, seeing that African continent had the second highest level of growth, but in the world, but was not creating enough jobs, and therefore inequality was increasing in many countries. So what were other solutions? One was productive transformation, which was the theme for 2019. In the context of COVID, we looked at digital transformation for quality jobs, where we saw in a nutshell that while the telecom sector is very important for transformation, economic productivity, and creating jobs, just targeting only the sector may not be enough to create the millions of jobs that African people need. So what is really important is having the linkages, so the indirect job creation through the digital transformation. So looking at the startups and others, they have very important role to play, but it's important that they are not islands of excellence and that they can be integrated. Having linkages with different economic sectors. And then we looked at value chains in the context of the implementation of the African Continental Free Trade Area, investment, and this year we are looking at skills. So this is one project, very big, because every year it looks at different things. A second project, the OECD is working a lot on taxes. So we work on revenue statistics in Africa, which uses the same methodology to compare tax and non-tax revenues in African countries with OECD countries, Asian countries, and countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. And what we could see is that while some African countries have, low levels of domestic resource mobilization, if you take Nigeria, one of the largest economies in the continent, tax to GDP ratio is only 5.6%. So it's not enough to realize development. But if you look then at other countries, take South Africa, Morocco, Tunisia, has up to 34% of tax to GDP ratio, which is more than the OECD average, which is about 2%. So we can see that there is a lot of complementarity between the different African countries, and we need to have tailored approaches. A third aspect we look at is investment. So we have a platform, the African Virtual Investment Platform, that we're also implementing with the African Union. We also look at quality infrastructure. And finally, we spoke about policy dialogue. We have a forum, an annual forum called the Africa Forum, or International Economic Forum on Africa, now in its 23rd edition. And that is taking place, bringing policymakers from Africa to the OECD. So it usually takes place at the OECD, and it's also in partnership with the African Union, but it has also taken place in Africa in the past, including in Senegal, for instance.
Okay. Wow, many projects that you lead with your team, very, very interesting. And but I would like to focus first. We will talk about the other projects also, if you allow me. But I would like to focus our talk today in the Africa Dynamics report, Africa Development Dynamics report. Sorry, and let me start asking you about the financing gap that the report states is around 194 billion dollars per year that Africa gaps for a sustainable financing. And I would like to ask you, sorry, what are the main significant implication of that gap, and how the OECD suggests to reduce this, I would say, terrific gap?
Thank you, Navin, for highlighting this main finding of the 2023 report on investment, where we try to show that while a lot of effort had been made, we have still a lot to do to achieve the Agenda 2063 and the Sustainable Development Goal. So this gap of about 194 billion per year until 2030 was estimated by looking at the needs, on the one hand, to reach the Sustainable Development Goals using estimations made by the OECD and UNCTAD for that, and looking at the funds that were available, including government revenues of African government, which is the highest share, but also external financial inflows, such as capital inflows, including foreign direct investment, but also remittances sent by African migrants to African countries, and finally overseas development aid that can also aims to support the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals. So 194 billion annual was calculated in that way, and it's a lot taken as a ballpark figure. But it is also not so much. It is bridgeable, if you like, because if we look at the total assets that are available, the financial assets globally, this 194 billion, it represents only 0.2% of global assets that are available globally. Now, of course, a lot of this money comes from sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and others. So it would be difficult to allocate all of that money to bridge the gap in the African continent. But if we look at the African assets, this 194 billion per year, it's 10.5% of the African assets. And that points to a specific type of problem that we see on the African continent, is that much of the money held, including by African pension funds and others, tends to be invested not in the African continent, but outside because of because of various reasons. And finding ways to attract more of all types of capital, but particularly capital coming from the African continent, is very important, and it would be enough to meet the Sustainable Development Goals and achieve the visions of Africa's development from African countries. So, in other words, we should not be discouraged, but there's a lot of opportunities, even by only using the African assets. So that's, I think, is a very important finding from the report, because the resources are in the continent. They, of course, can be also be leveraged with partners from outside, and I'm one of them. But the resources are in the continent. So I think that's very important, to look at ways to better use the assets that are already on the continent. Now you were asking me about how to bridge the gap. So that's a very very big question, difficult to answer in a few seconds. But we mainly looked at 3 different types of policy actions, which is the first leverage is better information. So improving having better data to reduce the risk perception in different African countries. The second tool is having better finance and sustainable finance, but just increasing money will not be enough. It has to be Africa-led. So it has to be led by African institutions in order to have matching the investment with the development strategies of the countries, but building the local capacity is crucial. And if it's done by non-African institutions, it will. We need to have more of this African-led sustainable finance to drive the agenda and implement it and evaluate it and to be successful. And finally, the third leg, if you like, is regional integration. Now, regional integration can look like a different animal when we talk about investment, but it can be very helpful in many ways. First, because some countries are small. We mentioned Rwanda, for instance, but there are many other small economies on the continent, and they will not be able to manage it on their own to attract, in particular, to attract investment. So for these smaller economies, regional integration will be very important. But equally for the larger ones, the development corridors, the infrastructure are very important to provide access to very basic public goods. And here, regional integration, for example, we take the example of the African Clean Energy Corridor, using public-private partnership to increase the access to power in the East and Southern Africa, can also help by lifting basic constraints on business delivery, like access to power and electricity, and then in order to attract more investment in the countries in these 2 regions. So that's one good example of how regional integration can also be important. But that also includes harmonization of standards in order to be able to attract more at the regional level. I'd be very happy to deepen on any of these points.
Precisely. I was going to ask you about if in terms of finance, that we tend to think that the financial sector in Africa is a bit weak. To open an LC and trade is challenging for European companies or American companies, and investor confidence is low and also the cost of capital is high. So the finance is there in Africa. How African policies and initiatives improve that financial sector to attract more, to first strengthen the financial sector and then attract more international or foreign investment? How the OECD sees that?
So you pointed to very important elements. The first one, I think, is the issue of investor perception. So and that is, according to us, the main barrier to investment. Why it's a barrier? It's because so many opportunities are in the continent. A growing population, very rapidly urbanizing population, growing middle class, second highest young. So there's also very important ecosystems. And the problem is that risks tend to be overrated and misperceived. So, and as a result of that, as you highlighted, the cost of capital is a lot higher. So if you take energy, and in particular solar energy, where African countries have a lot more endowments than Europe, for example, the cost of capital to invest in energy projects is 7 times higher in Africa, including for solar energy, than in Europe or in North America. So that gives you an idea of, the gap between the opportunities, take solar energy, and what is actually happening. So having better access to information, data, to reduce the investment risk perception is absolutely fundamental, because it will first increase the number of projects that are financed. But second, it will also decrease the cost of capital, so decrease the cost of borrowing, and increase the flow of financing. So it will really unlock a lot of potential. So that's very important. And so you asked specifically about the African institutions, financial institutions. What can they do? So a lot can be done here, for example, by pulling different data types together on the risk assessment of different types of projects, countries. For example, we have new partnerships with development banks. The African Development Bank, for example, is working with others to develop a database on country and project level risk, the GEMS database. So that can be one way to do that, but it can also be done by national financial institutions. Also use private institutions can also see to what extent, of course, bearing confidentiality and ownership of the data, but we have a lot more possibilities today, including for credit rating, with new technologies that are really widespread on the continent, through digital technologies that can enable to pull different resources, data sources together. So that's one aspect. A second aspect is working with different stakeholders together, and we have many examples of that in the report. For example, the Kenya pension fund has been able to pull with many different pension funds in Kenya who are small, but then pull the assets together, working with different stakeholders to have a much larger and therefore much more solid and sustainable pension fund, and that was able to raise more capital to increase the size and being able to increase its own return on investment. So that's another good example we have in the region. But if we look at other tools, climate finance, for example, can also be important as a way to strengthen the regional capacity. We have very good examples from countries like Morocco or Egypt, who managed to mobilize about $1.1 billion in climate finance through green bonds. So they managed to leverage that over a longer period of time, so between 2014 and 2021. So we need to be cautious about, it takes time to leverage and to build the instruments. But at the same time, these countries have developed specific legal frameworks, partnerships, and they can share these experiences with other African countries to gain from that. And one good example of that, where there is a big gap in terms of climate finance, despite the huge potential, are countries from Central Africa. In Central Africa, we have about 11% of the global stock of carbon, so very important for climate, global warming and climate change, to absorb global carbon emissions. But these countries capture less than 1% of global finance. And if you look at the African scale, it's 5.3% of the climate finance that comes to Africa. Although, again, they make 11% of the global stock of carbon. And so strengthening the institutions in these countries, the frameworks, increasing the transparency, the governance mechanism, but also improving the data and the awareness that these institutions exist and are there with funds is very important. As a concrete example of that, the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Gabon, for example, has created the first sovereign sovereign wealth fund linked to the ecosystem, so a green fund. So the first one in Africa. And so these are very concrete examples that are happening today as we speak. So the environment is evolving fast, and a lot can be done to continue to leverage these experiences.
I'm really glad, Arthur, that you're sharing all these examples of how the finance sector is improving in African countries, because one of the main reasons of this podcast is to mitigate all those stereotypes, no? And finance comes always at the table that there's low finance and all that. So thanks for sharing those valuable examples. Things are changing in finance sector in Africa, and that's a good news to trade and invest. Um,